Welcome, welcome, welcome. Excited to have everybody here. My name is Steve Botts. I'm the VP of Revenue for Jones, and I sidekick as a webinar host. This is probably my eighth or ninth webinar I've done at this point. But super excited to welcome two of our customers and partners to the call. First, we have Adam Santos, who's the president of the Premier Companies, which is a real estate property management company based on the East Coast and here in the U.S. Adam, welcome. Thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And Jessica Allen is the insurance manager for Manhattan Construction, a large general contractor based in the Midwest here. And thank you again, Jessica, for the time today. Super excited to have you here and to chat.
Thanks for inviting me.
And in addition to having, a good deal of experience with, Jones, I think both Manhattan and Premier have been on the platform for over, 2 years, I think at this point, or almost 2 years at this point, at least. Jessica and Adam both have amazing experience. So Jessica has been at Manhattan for 23 years. Congratulations. That's just tremendous. And Adam's been at Premier Companies for 18 years, right? So this is just wonderful. And I think today here, one of the big things we're going to talk about is really some of the time savings and the costs and benefits of actually implementing a solution for managing insurance certificates. And some of the things that we're excited to dive into here is, having Jessica and Adam here, we have two really great perspectives. One is the construction perspective and the perspective of a general contractor versus the perspective of a real estate property manager and to some extent like an owner and operator, with respectively where Jessica and Adam sit. And then also just given their roles at each company, we also have Jessica's perspective as being more sort of like boots on the ground, dealing with some of these problems on a day-to-day basis, and Adam, as the president, maybe seeing them more from an executive point of view. And so super excited to get both your perspectives on these as we get involved here. So without further ado, let's get into it. So first, let's talk about the real sort of like costs for COI management. And Jessica, I'll start with you. I think there's a lot of like what I would say classic challenges that people probably think of when they think of like the time associated with the insurance administration. But maybe you could just talk a little bit about, from your perspective, what were some of those like classic challenges that you guys, dealt with from an insurance compliance standpoint historically?
So for us, it was more of the time consumingness of it. We had to have the manpower and the people to take on reviewing all of our COIs. And as being a large GC, like right now we have 3,000 insurance certificates that we have to review. So that just right there is a time suck. And then trying to continually get the certificate and get it from everyone. All the daisy chain effect of us requesting it from our field team, them requesting it from the sub, requesting it from the agent, and then getting it back along that time chain. It just really took all of the time and manpower away from other opportunities that, we could have been spending our time on. So
Yeah, and I think like what we were talking about before is like, this is a job to be done, but it's not the only job that sort of you have to do, right?
yeah, so Jones taking over our COI management has opened up other opportunities for us to use our manpower elsewhere, and also saved us from having to hire additional people to spend time just reviewing certificate after certificate.
Yeah, you mentioned sort of that daisy chain. What was like could you just kind of share a little bit about like how does that process look like internally when you're kind of getting this documentation from a project context?
So prior to Jones, we would have our contract administrator request it from the sub, who would then request it from their broker. The broker would give it back to the sub, which give it back to the CA, that would give it to us. And unfortunately, as many of you guys know, insurance is never right the first time. So we would then give it back to the CA, who would give it back to the sub, and then back to the agent. And you just spent a lot of time wasting going back and forth between so many people, because there was no cutting out the middleman, because one person couldn't request it all. And you never know if the sub wants you to go to their insurance agent. So it was just a big long chain of people that took, a long time, sometimes 30 days before you finally got it right, just because it had to touch so many hands.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned that key point is like most of the time, you go through this and then there's something missing or something, that needs to get addressed. So you kind of force function this sort of need to go back and sort of redo it all again, which is kind of, it's kind of just baked into the process at this point, right? Like it would be nice if everything was just compliant, the first time you got it, right?
That would be amazing, but very unrealistic in our industry.
uh and Adam, I know from your perspective, right, you have a team of people, but maybe you could just share a little bit about like what your organization looks like, and then how insurance is being handled within Premier.
Yeah, so I mean, we're a smaller company, right? We have about 20 folks and 60 properties or so. Obviously, grown quite a bit over the years, but unlike a lot of mid-size or larger companies, we don't have in-house insurance compliance team or a department, right? So for us, the burden always fell on our administrative staff to try to manage that process and tracking certificates of insurance. So we have today over 500 tenants. So what does that mean? We have to track COIs for every single tenant, right? And thoroughly review all of the insurance requirements in each lease and interpret and understand those requirements and vet those against the COIs. On top of that, as anyone really in commercial real estate knows, every lease is different. Some go back 20, 30 years. We have too many of those, but and a lot of the requirements are very esoteric. It's tough, to manage all of that. And even though there's standard forms and structures, they're just all different, right? So you really do have to review every single one very thoroughly. And then we're reviewing amendments and assignments, and these things change over time and evolve over time. So just trying to track and manage that process, it's very tedious, and you have to be well versed in insurance to really understand that. And then, really when we're onboarding new tenants, and assigning leases, taking on new properties, that process can't be opaque, right? And it really needs to be very crystal clear to all of the tenants and to our administrative staff as well, because it creates delays, inefficiencies, other risks. So I think at a high level, you want to make sure your administrative staff is working on more higher priority items. And for us, that just was not the case for many, many years as we were trying to manage all of this internally. And so, and I think that poses a lot of risk for our stakeholders, for ourselves as a management company, but also as owners and operators.
Yeah, and I definitely want to get into that more, but I think that's sort of like you guys both mentioned this, and I think that's one of kind of the big hidden costs. And from our original conversation, it kind of like evoked this sort of visual in my head where it's like you think about the people in your organization and the work that needs to be done, and you think about like what is the most important, right? Things. And we talked about this in your world, Adam. It's like, hey, I want my PMs focused on leasing, tenancy, project management, expense management, and then like, there's administrative functions like insurance, compliance. But like that ends up being this thing that just takes a lot of time because it's such an administrative process and there's so many administrative aspects to it that it's sort of this like, not only is it lower on the priority, but it's like a disproportionate amount of time that needs to be done in order to do it correctly, right?
Yeah, absolutely. No, unfortunately, it gets relegated as a lower priority item, as again, you're trying to allocate your time and resources to, things that are much more productive and are driving revenue and growth, right, for your organization. So I think for us, we knew it was important, and we knew that the risks, but it's a tough thing to manage when you really, you want to be spending your time doing things that are more productive.
Right. And I'm sure even for you, Jessica, right, and the folks in your department, the people in that daisy chain, right, they're probably not the most excited when they have to stop what they're doing to address, a vendor insurance compliance item, right?
Definitely not a fan favorite. Very
When
many
they're
people were
probably could
excited
be
to see
focused
it.
on bidding or, cost management or contract management, right?
Yes.
Um, So, I think that just in summary, right, there's some classic and some hidden costs right here. So the classic ones are all the time and effort associated with collecting these documents. You mentioned, Jessica, that ability just not, this just can't be any old resource, right? You need somebody who knows what an endorsement CG 2010 endorsement is versus a CG 2037, and that's not the same as somebody who's just going to be, doing data entry. Not only you have to do these processes, but then that information has to get administrated elsewhere, right? It's used for tracking, for reporting, for claims. We'll talk about billing in a few minutes. And then there's just this like ongoing nature. Not only is is it challenging, but it's not even one and done. So you just, you might get all this document together and then something renews, and then all of a sudden you got to go back and start it over. But I think the hidden costs that people don't necessarily consider when they're like, oh, we're not really spending that much time on this, is that it's taking time away from higher priority items. And like, Adam, you mentioned it, right? 20 people in your organization. You keep saying you're kind of a small organization. There might be people on this call that are, smaller than you, right? And you also mentioned in our pre-call, like, hey, I'm sure bigger companies have departments here, but Jessica, Manhattan's a pretty large construction company, right? I don't imagine you guys are, that enables you to then have a lot of, budget to allocate towards hiring, additional administrative staff, right? You're probably still under the same, desires to create more efficiency, in your organization, I would imagine, right?
Correct. I mean, we have 6 people in our department, but we have over $1.5 billion in revenue. So the proportion to the revenue versus people is, I mean, we try to keep it lean.
Yeah. And then, the other thing about this is that because the nature of this insurance, compliance issue is there's so many administrative aspects, it grows like disproportionate, right? Like, you talked about 3,000 records and 500 tenants, Adam, but if you take over more properties, or if you guys have more projects, like the number of insurance documents and leases and extractions and all these different things is going to be compounded, right? It's not as linear as maybe some of your other functions.
Right. I mean, even when we were half the size, we probably needed, at least a minimum a half-time person to manage this process, right? And as you continue to grow, you can't just continue to hire people to try to manage all of this and keep track of all the COIs. It's just not really possible as a small company.
Yeah. And this little thing that I think we'll get into more is like, you end up, if you mentioned that process, hey, if it's not clear when a new project comes on, if not that daisy chain of things isn't, what ends up happening is this is gonna spill over to somebody's bucket who shouldn't be doing this, right? A property manager that should be working on a tenant issue needs to deal with an insurance issue, or someone that needs to be dealing with a contract or a bidding issue is going to have to deal with an administration issue around insurance compliance, and that's just obviously not the way you guys want your organizations running.
Okay.
Awesome. So, we talked about this and cost and all this stuff. And then, I kind of asked like, well, why bother? If it's such a pain, why do it? Right. And I see you cringing a little there, Jessica, but we do have people we talk to who just say like, we don't even collect insurance anymore, when we get on the phone with them. And given the fact that Jones has 300 clients, it's and from the conversations we have and the horror stories we've heard, that's such a stark contrast. But Jessica, maybe you can talk about like why do you guys, what's the sort of mantra at Manhattan? I know you guys like are pretty strict about needing to have insurance for your subs.
Well, I mean, because you just honestly need to manage your risk. If you don't get your insurance from your subcontractors, and I know everybody says, well, I've never had a claim. Well, you've never had one until you have one, and then you never know if you're going to have another, and it just keeps compounding. And we don't want the higher cost to impact us in our way of doing business, because if we don't have their insurance to fall back on, it falls back onto our insurance, and then we have issues with keeping our costs down and everything to, make our hiring us manageable, because you have to pass the cost along somewhere, and you don't want to be ultimately responsible for every claim and everything that happens on a project, especially when some of it's out of your control. So you don't want your business to be impacted because you're having to pay claims and, do things for mismanagement of other companies, or you end up having employees by, default because their company was like, well, there's only 2 of them, I don't need workers' comp. And then unfortunately, accidents happen and people get hurt, and you don't want your company to be the one paying for that whenever their employer should be the one taking care of their employees via workers' comp. And then there's products claims and so many other claims that you just want to make sure that you're getting the proper coverage from your subcontractors, because it'll affect your business if you don't.
And I want to kind of talk about it a little more, because I think that's sort of like the 800-pound gorilla in the room, right? But it is kind of hard sometimes for people to think about that, the potential cost avoidance when it maybe doesn't show up in their budget or balance sheet every day. But you mentioned about like insurance has there's things for other departments, right? You need insurance for bids, right? You need insurance for contracts, you need insurance for payments. And so you talked a little bit about like, hey, it takes 45 days sometimes to get insurance, and there can be other costs to the business, if the insurance isn't in place. So maybe you could share a little bit more about some of those like consequential impacts.
So we're very strict on insurance compliance. You have to have your insurance certificate fully approved before you're allowed to step foot on site. So we don't want to be the department that's holding back the progress of the schedule, because we've made a promise to an owner that we're going to get this project done in a certain amount of time. And we don't want, big bad risk management holding back the schedule or delaying payments to subs or something because we don't allow them on site. We won't pay them without their insurance. Like, everything has to be in place in order for them to do what we hired them to do. And it's just another chain reaction. If you have one sub that has to start late because they don't have insurance, and then the next sub starts late because the first sub's behind schedule, and then before you know it, you're trying to recover your schedule, or you have a sub that's mad because they haven't been paid and they don't want to work on another job, but their insurance isn't up to date on one job. So it just kind of has a chain reaction effect if we don't have the insurance in place.
Yeah, and not, we're not going to ask anyone to name names, but I mean, like, I would imagine, right? There are probably some folks, there's some executives at Manhattan who, they may not think about insurance compliance. It may not be the COIs might not keep them up at night the same way they keep you up at night, but project delays, right? Or payment issues with subcontractors, those are going to impact the bottom line, and those are going to start to and I'm sure nobody wants to say, hey, why is this project delayed a week? And what are the financial consequences of that? Oh, it's because, this sub couldn't get on site because they didn't have insurance in place. And then we couldn't get them back out for, another week, as you said. And I'm sure you could point to situations where that's happened, and those have been real conversations, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It definitely has happened, and unfortunately you just end up in recovery mode, and you never want to be behind to start with. You always want to get ahead, not behind.
Yeah, absolutely. And Adam, we talked, and you mentioned, not only like a fiduciary, obligation just because you guys are the property manager to your clients, but you said it kind of impacts the property, it could impact the company and the owner. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about, your perspective from where you sit.
Yeah, so look, I get it if you're maybe you only own one property or a couple properties, maybe you haven't had a claim in the past, right? Or it's a small shopping center. You may not think that this is important, right? But for us, I mean, I saw the benefits really at the property level, which I can talk about in a minute, and then also at the ownership level, right? So really affecting both us as owners and managers. And for us, really, again, short of hiring more help, sort of knew that we were in the same cycle of trying to handle it internally and doing so, I think, frankly, poorly, right? And what does Einstein say? Like, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over, right? And expecting a different result. Like, that's how it felt for us. And so, when we found out there was an automated solution out there, it's like, okay, we can address this weakness for our company. We can reallocate our administrative, staff's time to, for more productive means, right? And then also protect interests of our owners and investors and ourselves, right? I mean, there's so many different types of incidents that can occur at a property, right? And Jessica made a comment earlier, but like for us, like if, or in my view anyway, like if you, unless you've only owned property for a few months or a year or something like that, most likely you've probably dealt with some sort of claim or incident over the years. I mean, trip and falls are very common at shopping centers, office buildings, whatever. I mean, if you think about it, right, for any property that is at least more than one or two tenants, you're likely having hundreds, if not thousands, of visitors a day, right? It could be, to a medical practice. It could be to, a larger shopping center. I mean, you have a lot of people passing through that property, and you're exposed if you have a pothole or some other thing that could be a tripping hazard. Or I mean, we have
somebody left tools behind, or even like little,
exactly. There's all sorts of types of things that could cause an issue, right? And from the tenant COI or scenario perspective, if let's say there's a personal injury at their workplace, right? If they're underinsured or uninsured, or they're just otherwise not in compliance, right? Those pose risks to yourself as a company, because you haven't been tracking that, and you haven't been collecting to make sure that they're in compliance with their insurance requirements, and and same thing, posing risk to the stakeholders as well.
You mentioned also something about you have a master policy, which I thought was interesting, because you work with some folks might be property managers, some might be vertically integrated office owners, but in your world you work with clients who own buildings who need your services, right? But you have a lot of different properties that belong to different people. But maybe you could tell a little bit more how your master policy works, and how there's some what's that word I hear all the time now, there's some exposure there to all these different properties.
Oh, it's true. So, I mean, the benefit of a master policy is really you're leveraging your scale, right? So, because we have 60 assets, all commercial, many of which we own, many of which we manage for third parties, right? We're able to get much better pricing on our insurance premiums as a result of having policy at scale like that, right? So, when we go out to the market to bid, we're going to travelers and all these Hanover and all these different insurance companies, say, look, we have 60 properties you can bid on versus one or two. You're not going to get great pricing, right? So that's the benefit of it. But the problem is it also exposes you at scale, right? So if you have one incident that happens at a particular property and there's a claim, there's a lawsuit, then it's affecting your insurance rates across the board. It's not just impacting that one property. So that's why it's ultra important for us to be managing that risk across the board.
Yeah, and you talked about also not only that, but there's also just costs associated with managing claims and legal expenses and other things that if that can be real and these costs at some point all funnel down to your property impact, either your leasing, because you get it increases your expenses that you have to pass through, or it falls on your end, and then I imagine it's impacting your NOI or your profitability on some level, right?
Yeah, for each property. I mean, especially for the ones that are full service. Anyone in commercial real estate will know, right? That if we have like an office or a medical building, and it's most of those leases are going to be full service. So really, the ownership is absorbing most of that the cost, right? So it very much affects your bottom line. For retail properties, most of those leases are triple net, so you're passing that cost through. But if your insurance premiums go up as a result of having some claim that could have otherwise been mitigated, right, then all of the tenants are impacted. You're passing that through to them. So
right,
yeah,
and that affects marketability, right? If they're looking at space in another place and their leasing costs are
absolutely. And if that's driving your triple net costs up as a result of that, that's not good.
Yeah. One thing, we were talking about claims. You mentioned trips and falls and stuff, and I've heard just the amount of stories I've heard and things that have come across my desk having worked at Jones for 5.5 years is, I mean, I won't say I've heard it all, but I've heard some just things I never would have expected. I'm sure you guys in your 23 and 18 years have seen and heard way more than I do, but you talked about just people driving into buildings. And Jessica, it sounded like you've had situations where people have accidentally backed into stuff. There's just so many little ways that these kind of claims can pop up, right?
Yeah, they can happen anywhere, and that's why like we have airport projects where you have to, have a higher auto limit, because can you imagine backing into a plane by accident? That's not cheap to fix. So definitely different things that you don't ever think of. You're like, oh, well, I'm just building this over here. But then if the plane is anywhere in your path, or just, little things like that, or if someone presses the brake, or the gas instead of the brake and ends up on the structure you just put up, then you have to do all sorts of testing to make sure the building's, structurally sound, because you can't just move forward when something's happened to the building.
Right.
So,
Right. And a lot of times, they say, okay, well, the person that was driving the vehicle into your building or whatever, or structure, is, oh, well, their insurance is going to pay. Well, sometimes they're not properly insured, or they have limits on, so, and if it causes major damage to the structure of the building, I mean, it could be hundreds of thousands of dollars, right?
Yeah.
So there is still potential risk there.
Yeah.
And it happens way more than you would ever think. I don't know why we're a magnet for that, but
Well, and I've talked to people too who haven't maybe had as much experience with like even these kinds of trips and falls claims or something. But I remember on a call and I was talking to somebody about they were in Oklahoma, and they were like, well, this is really important. We got to make sure. And I was like, why? And I was just kind of trying to challenge them, like, why is it so important? Why do you need to go to your executives and tell them this? And he said something crazy, which I had never thought of, but like, he's like, we have natural disasters. We have tornadoes, right? He's like, if somebody's illegally storing like a propane tank in their, behind their office space, and a tornado comes through and that explodes and affects the center, that is a insurance incident that, would hurt us. Now, that might be an extreme example, but there's other examples in like places like Miami where you have like, tide waters come in, and then you have a laundromat, and they have chemicals on premises, and it just kind of was like, wow, there's all these even just, unforeseen, uncontrollable forces, that can conspire to all of a sudden create a claim, right? That may be an issue for you. And as we said, the cost of a claim is the kind of 800-pound gorilla in the room. It might not be the thing that you experience all the time, but it's the thing that can have the most like seismic impact on your cost of operating your business. Especially in a world where I imagine you guys have seen your premiums go up regardless, right?
yeah.
Even without claims. We all know it's a hard market. So quickly recapping, insurance is not just claims avoidance. There's other consequences, maintaining your other operations. There's all these like knock-on effects to not having insurance in place. It could be project move-ins, or getting a tenant fit out completed, or a preventative maintenance issue fixed, payments processing, vendor relationships, and then kind of this thing that like all people who operate on any meaningful scale have some level of risk exposure, whether they choose to believe it or not. I just think it's worth mentioning that, because I could think of some customer or prospects we've talked to even in the last weeks where, they just seemed, completely unfazed by the fact that they had no process in place for this. And those costs are really detrimental. All right. So, we've talked a little bit about the problems. We not talked about what the potential impact is. Let's talk about like what's been the actual real savings impacts to your business. So, Jessica, you first, right? Pre-Jones, post-Jones, what are some of the things that you really have experienced as, impacting your bottom line and your real savings?
So for us, it saved us from hiring. So I'll tell a funny story. We ran into Jones at a convention, and I laughed at them, and I was like, you're going to take my job. We're never going to hire you. And then before you know it, we had someone who left for another opportunity. And then we had one of our ladies that did it full time. She announced her retirement. And at the same time, we were growing. So we went from, back then we were a department of 6. And then the next thing you know, we were a department of 4. And there, at one point there were 4 of us that were working on reviewing certificates. And then it was down to 2, and we just couldn't keep up. And then you have to worry about, okay, can I find someone who wants to review insurance all the time? Not everybody is an insurance nerd like me and doesn't love to read certificates and endorsements and things like that. So finding the right fit and, getting them trained and then hired to stay was the challenge that we were facing. And we were like, do we need 2 people? Do we need 3 people? Like, how many people are we going to need? Because we're continually growing. We want to also focus the time of the people who are left on other things like pre-qualifications and other, risk management tasks in the department. And that's when we really started to seek out Jones. And because we hired Jones, we haven't had to hire anyone else to manage our insurance. We went from 4 people doing it. And granted, it wasn't their full-time job, but they were spending a lot of time on it to
Well, I
where,
think that's the point, right?
yeah,
Those are folks that have other really important work to do. Like, you don't want them spending more than 10, 20, 30% of their time on insurance compliance, right? So like, I think that speaks directly to this point of like this sort of like, it's probably the least important item they have in their jobs to be done, but it might be one of the things that like takes a disproportionate amount of time to do.
it took the most amount of time. So when we were able to hire Jones, we did, backfill a few spots, but it was to focus on other areas that were as important to us as insurance, but we didn't have to backfill him to spend that time on insurance because Jones has taken over it for us. Now I get some help whenever I get super far behind if I do, but Jones does it all. So I'm the only one who really touches our insurance on a day-to-day basis. And our compliance rates, which means our approval rates have gone up. So before, when we were doing it manually and tracking it all manually, we were, probably at 70 to 75% of compliance rating. And then just with Jones, we've been able to get up to 90%, and we have more people approved quicker and back to work and everything. And it has just helped our business overall with this.
And you've mentioned that there's been some of those like knock-on effects, like the time to get approved has gone down. So, it's not every job, but there are instances where it's like, this is the situation where we might have had a project delay. We don't have those. We don't have as many, you mentioned you don't have as many payment delays as you used to.
Yeah.
Just because like the information wasn't getting from one bucket to another. I think you guys have an integration, I think that helps not only with the review, but like we actually feed the data into your payment system. So
Yeah.
that's where that helps additionally provide some of those
That's
savings.
an extreme help. And also, Jones has automatic renewal reminders. So I know we all know we're not getting our renewal 30 days out, but Jones goes ahead and sends them, hey, a reminder, in 30 days, your insurance is going to get expired. And they get a couple more reminders up until that expiration date. So we've seen us get insurance, previously it was expired and we would, go in that daisy chain process where it would go back and forth, and it would sometimes take up to 30 days, if not longer, to get it. And we've seen that time significantly drop. Like, we have a big hit on big renewal periods, but usually within 2 weeks, like, we're right back to where we were and everybody's good to go. And that's, everyone in the first week, the number significantly jumps back up. Like, we're getting our certs a lot quicker now.
So, you mentioned going from like deep skepticism to sort of like embracing it. I mean, would you say, you would say like at this point, you're convinced this has been a good investment?
This has been amazing. Yeah, it was really funny because we were 100% against it. My coworker Julie and I were at a conference and we cut up and laughed with 2 of the guys that were there. I don't even remember who it was. And we're like, we're never going to use someplace like you. And now I couldn't imagine what we would do without someone like you to help us keep our insurance in line.
And I think more importantly, like you had to convince there had to be some approvals for this internally, right? But I imagine now they're looking at some of those things you've talked about where it's like we have a leaner team, we're able to do more with less. And you said that you're taking on new initiatives like pre-qualification, which I thought was super interesting. You mentioned an example of like a low bid contractor. Maybe you could just talk about like what's an unlock now that you have this extra time.
So we have expanded our pre-qualification process, so we get to know our subs and vendors more intimately before they get awarded a project. And I know on some hardwood projects, you have to take low bidders, and sometimes you were doing that and not realizing who you were signing up to use. So we have a real robust pre-qualification process now where we do a deep dive into, are they able to do the work? Do they have the manpower? Do they have the capacity? What's their safety? What's our potential risks there? So we've been able to expand our pre-qualification process and get to know the people we're working with better.
And I mean, it's again hard to put a number on it, but I mean, being able to get ahead of and avoid a safety or a insurance or a subcontractor default issue before it even comes up because you've been able to do a better pre-qual, I can only imagine that has, big compounding effects for the business and something that your executives are, see as a big, value add.
Yes, it's definitely a value add because one sub going out of business, depending on how many projects you have, can just have a snowball effect on your bottom line, depending on what they're doing and where they, where they are in your process.
And you mentioned it's hard. It can be hard to hire somebody for this job because it isn't the most glamorous thing. Like you do this, how has this had a benefit on just your sort of like, I don't know, level of engagement at work, the fact that you're taking on maybe different, more interesting tasks related to insurance or prequal?
I mean, I've loved it because I've been able to expand my knowledge and grow more in the risk management side because I started out as an operations folks, which on the construction side, that meant I was out in the field. So I was doing other tasks before I joined our risk management department, and I knew the operations side very well as being out on site every day. But here I, am growing and learning more about the behind the house stuff that most of the people on the job site don't know. So it has allowed me to grow in my career and learn more on that side that I don't have to spend all the time reading insurance anymore.
Well, here's to another 23 years, hopefully, right?
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Adam. We talked, how you were like, oh, the idea of Jones was super attractive. And you had some challenges though, even. So maybe talk a little bit about your experience and sort of what that journey's been like.
Yeah, no, I think, kind of opposite experience to what Jessica had there. Like, we were thrilled when we first learned about you guys, right? I was like, oh, we can outsource this. We're going to fully automate the process, soup to nuts, and like, we're not going to really have to hopefully do very much, right? I think what we quickly realized was, the process still requires our input and sort of nuanced judgment, right? And we ran into a lot of issues early on. And I think it is a credit to you guys for sticking with us and working with us throughout that process, and even inviting me on here because we did have some real issues early on. I mean, we had one of the things was our tenants were they tried to call you and they couldn't get a response. They're hitting dead ends, right? We were having issues with like the cadence and frequency of emails. They were going out like too often, right, to the tenants. Their tenants are like, this is a total nuisance, right? And then there were a lot of like gaps in insurance. We realized a lot of those gaps were very trivial. And so, there were just like a host of issues. And just for us, we were like, okay, let's hit the pause button. Let's level set here and figure out, what is it that, is most important to us, right? And I think what came out of that was realizing that, so many of these esoteric, sort of provisions that are hidden in these leases, some of them, again, are 20, 30 years old, right? And don't really matter or apply as much anymore. And then for us, it's like, okay, just getting a certificate of insurance was the most important thing, right? Making sure that we were listed as an additional insured, making sure the certificate holder information was correct, and like basic minimums that, these tenants need to meet, right? So trying to like standardize that across the board. So once we kind of did all of that and we realized like, hey, we have a customized solution here, right? Just because you guys were able to work with us on all of that, and then we implemented it, we saw a pretty significant gain, right out of the box. I think it was like something like 20, 30%, an increase in compliance. But what was still missing was that human touch, right? Because we still didn't really have anyone on like Jones' end to answer those calls, to field those questions, to really be able to address, issues that maybe the tenants had, right? Or maybe their insurance folks had, to, making sure, again, those gaps in compliance were properly addressed. So then you guys rolled out the operator, which are live Jones agent / operator, and that really got us to that next level. And
Yeah, I mean, I think that you guys rolled that out like the beginning, maybe like third quarter of last year.
right.
And what's been sort of the impact, from then to now?
It's been amazing, honestly. I mean, not only is our compliance and collection rates way up, just the fact that our tenants have someone to talk to, and because again, this a lot of the language, even in their own policies, they don't really understand. And when our administrative staff was handling it, they didn't really quite understand. So there was these gaps in communication, right? And trying to resolve that was challenging. So having someone on Jones' end that really is well versed in the lingo, it was hugely helpful and impactful to be able to resolve those issues.
And that was an additional cost, right? So, you had
very nominal.
right. And I mean, for you, looking back on it, you kind of said like you felt like it was sort of the missing piece of kind of the puzzle there.
Yeah, because I think that human interaction is very important, and we don't want our customers, or our tenants, right, to feel like they're just hitting dead ends and not able to get a human on the phone.
Yeah.
That's experience, because as an organization, we pride ourselves in providing a very high touch, high level of service type of experience for our folks, and they weren't really getting that with this.
Right.
Granted, it's insurance, right? So it's like,
Well, we're talking about all the challenges and problems and frustrations of insurance,
right.
and I think as Jones, we've realized like we inherit all those, right?
Yeah,
And there's been kind of two big observations that I've seen in my seat here doing this, and I mean for what's worth, I've been in real estate and construction technology for the last like 15 years. Leasing software with companies like VTS, and cost and project management softwares with companies like Honest Buildings that went on to be acquired by Procore. So I've been working with real estate companies to solve operational challenges and construction problems. But two things about Jones are unique. One, it's not just an internal solution, right? It's not like you're just tracking your projects with your own people and you got to get them to use it. You got to get your customers and your tenants to engage. And as much as we make that process easy, not, it's still insurance. It's still complicated. People have hard enough time picking their own insurance benefits and comparing plans. Like they don't know what a waiver of subrogation is for, or a primary non-contributory clause is, right? So, and then you compound that with the fact that they need to get their broker involved. So I think over time we've realized like we need to offer maybe, or try to offer more services to round out that experience, to our clients. And I think that's the second piece, is that just insurance is not our customers' core business, right? They're real estate owners and operators, they're contractors, but they have this insurance piece, and the expertise there, and the esoteric nature of it is challenging. Our team is used to dealing with that. They deal with it every single day. We process 15,000 insurance packets a week. Like we deal with, so many examples. And so by kind of helping to plug that gap, I think it's something that's yielding the, types of results that you're seeing, which, is the operator. So this is kind of this layer of service that sits on top of the software to help take more of those administrative aspects, like phone calls and follow-up emails, and hey, I can't upload this COI. Would you just, I'll just email it to you, and making sure that all gets into the platform. So that's been a really, I think positive. And it's interesting in this conversation, because I think for our real estate customers, that's really where they've seen, we've seen an uptick in the adoption. And maybe Adam, hearing Jessica, kind of speaks to it, because in construction, the risks are higher, the rate of incidents is higher. In real estate, I don't, not saying this in any other way than objectively, like the insurance compliance process it's not as mature, for most real estate companies. And kind of what you were talking about, when they come on to Jones, a lot, like for construction companies, sometimes they come on to Jones and we're just automating what they're doing today. That's highly manual. For companies in the real estate, sometimes we're taking them from like 0 to 1. And it can actually be painful when they first start like getting all of this stuff coming through the wash, that hasn't been really, and they have to do some of that reconciliation work that you mentioned, right? Living through it now, I think you can maybe appreciate that a little bit more, right? Cool. So we talked about some key things here: the real savings, the direct reduction of time and tasks, the shifting of prioritization to more value added tasks, those knock-on operational benefits like time to value and things of that nature, unlocking these like productivity gains, which is super exciting to hear you guys have been able to do, like more impactful things by not focusing on this administrative stuff. And then from an ROI justification, it sounded like for you, Jessica, all those efficiencies are great, but when you actually look at the fact that you haven't been able to needed to backfill people, that's where you really are seeing, or as you grow, you might not need more administrative folks. That's probably where you're going to see some like really meaningful savings, right?
That's definitely our biggest savings. And because, like I said, it's really hard to find someone who just wants to read insurance all day. So not necessarily just having to backfill, but then having to backfill and backfill again, because you get someone you think that's going to be great. And then the next thing you know, they decided insurance wasn't for them. So you're starting the whole process over again. So that's been our biggest impact, is not having to backfill and then constantly maintain those positions to do it.
And for you, Adam, that administrator was doing other things to support the PM. So kind of again, maybe taking this off and then letting the PMs and the admins focus on stuff that you think is more sort of impactful for your business. Hopefully you're starting to see that now as we've gotten
Yeah.
the operator hungry.
Yeah, I mean, very similar experience to what Jessica has had there. I mean, we would have had to hire someone that really understood insurance compliance, because it just wasn't really working as it was. So that would have been an out-of-pocket cost and pretty expensive. And we've been able to sort of redirect and reallocate that human capital, right? The time, cost, resources all associated with that to much more higher priority, higher productive, sort of tasks, right? And so it just all comes down to opportunity cost. So it's been for us a savings, no doubt about it. I mean, we don't say like, oh, we're spending X, so we should be getting some quantifiable return, of Y. We don't really calculate it like that, but it's the savings is pretty obvious, because we haven't had to hire additional help for it, and we've been able to reallocate our administrative staff to better, projects and whatnot.
And I think this is, again, the last thing is kind of like, again, the 800-pound gorilla in the room, but it's hard in a sales conversation or prospecting conversation when someone doesn't see this in their budget, right? Like, to talk about it. But like, I don't know, you gave some practical examples. Maybe I'll start with you at first. It's like, again, these are costs that get sort of administrated into your leases and or your OpEx, right? And insurance is in there, right? So you talked about just like investing in this versus the thinking about having to, and giving a little more control over my insurance versus what the cost, like that's just like an A/B equation, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, one of the things that we realized was, first off, we were handling it on like the management company level previously, right? And that was just a cost we were eating. And then we realized, of course, all the risks associated with this. And once we found the Jones solution, it was like, okay, this is actually a cost we can pass through to all the properties, because at the end of the day, you're not just protecting your own interests, you're protecting the interests of your tenants, right? So, and it's a very small nominal cost. I mean, yes, they're already paying an insurance premium, for the property to properly insure, all of your property liability and whatnot. But for, if you have an incident, you have a claim and it affects all of your tenants and the costs go up, that's directly impacting your tenants. So I think we felt like that was very justified to be able to pass that cost through. So we went from absorbing it all previously to being able to pass through the majority of the cost and do so much more effectively, in terms of managing the risk.
And I think that might be as much, just people understanding, thinking about the mechanics of that and how it impacts their unit economics is really helpful. I mean, for you, Jessica, you guys have you kind of bake this into your project expenses, or so you found a way to offset some of these costs as well.
Yeah, it's definitely, we have a software fee that it gets implemented on each project, and it doesn't just cover Jones, it covers all the softwares that Manhattan has. So that's been able to kind of help pay for it in the background, but in the long run, they're saving because they're not paying for more people in the risk management department. So
right. And obviously a cost of a claim, and I don't know if you have like self-insured retention or some of these other, you have a deductible, right? Like we've heard, these costs they can go right to your project costs, and we're with your margins and stuff, those can just come right out of your pocket, right? It's not just like oh, the insurance company's going to cover this and then our premiums make it up.
Yeah, a claim, a bad claim can sink a project, and you don't want that. You don't want it to eat away at all your profits. So you want to make sure that you have the proper coverage and everything to make sure your project is protected and your fee is protected. Because as much as we love building buildings, we love it more to, our owners love us if we make money building the buildings and not just breaking even. So
Yep, I've heard that before.
Yeah.
Well, I had one anecdote on well, like this is another point on the operator. We had a client that had a person left the organization, and one of their main things was working on the insurance and the compliance management. And this was like the inflection point for us, where they were like, we're gonna have to hire somebody, we're gonna have to do all this stuff. And we kind of like, well, what if we created this operator offering that could kind of help, sit in there, and that was Kathleen was sort of patient zero for that, and they just saw a huge AB shift, similar to kind of the way Adam you articulated it. I'm gonna come back to the AI thing because I'll do a plug for our next web. Actually, let me do this plug so I don't get in trouble. But we have a webinar coming up in a month for AI insurance risk management, and we're gonna talk about like actual use of AI. Because I just feel like this is the most overused term in the world right now, and I'd love to get your comments. But I know there's some questions, and first and foremost, I just want to say a humongous thank you to you, Jessica, to you, Adam. Like, not only do we appreciate your business as customers, but really value your time and your insights. I think it really helps connect the dots to the real impact that we're trying to have here, and hopefully that came through. So appreciate your time, and thank you so much for spending with us here today.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah.
Likewise.
So we have some questions here. I see one from Sharon. Question for Adam. I also work at a small company, and we do not have dedicated risk resources. Who at your company handles escalations or questions when they're trying to push back on insurance you're trying to enforce? That's a part one.
So, early on in the Jones process, I think we realized that, first off, at the property manager level, I mean, most of them are pretty in tune to risk management and compliance issues and understand insurance at a more layman's level, right? So we were escalating any gaps in insurance questions or issues to them, or other questions that tenants might have. But if they couldn't resolve it, then it would get escalated to either myself or the other principal of the company. Because ultimately, we have the most experience and exposure to all of that. And so, it's not maybe the most ideal, but it is a model that has worked well for us.
Has some of that been getting addressed by the operator? Maybe
Yes.
before? Okay.
Yes, yeah. So yeah, before the operator, everything was getting escalated to us, right? And we were finding it was still fairly time consuming, kind of to my point earlier about, thinking this was going to be fully automated soup to nuts, but it really wasn't, right? So it was taking quite a bit of our time, and certainly the time of our property managers, who could be better spending their time doing other things, right? So the operator, once we brought her on, I mean, she's now able to kind of field almost all of those questions and answer those, or address the issues. And it's very rare that something gets escalated to us now.
That's great. Shout out. Karen, who's your operator?
Shout out Karen.
Yeah, she's
Awesome.
101. Jessica, question for you. Are you using a software for pre-quals, and are you connecting Jones to that in any ways?
We do have a software for pre-qualification, and it is not connected to Jones anyway. It is something that we have used previously for a long time, and it's tied with our Autodesk contract. We use TradeTap, and it's also tied to our bidding software and everything like that. So it's tied to the other side, the bidding and estimating side of things, and not Jones.
Maybe that's something for us to collaborate on.
Mm-hmm.
We have some pricing questions, Jake. We can probably get you some information right after the call. Anything? I don't see a ton of other questions right now. Any anecdotes or things that maybe we didn't hit on for you, Jessica or Adam, that come to mind here before we wrap up?
I guess a shameless plug for Jones. It's really been wonderful for our business. Like, I mean, this time savings, the cost savings, the compliance ratings, it's really helped us overall. And I mean, the majority of our subcontractors understand when there's a gap, and they give details on what is needed to fix it. We have pretty standard requirements across the board. It changes from job to job on additional insurance and things like that. But we were fearful at first that our subs would push back on it. And we do have a couple. We have the mom and pop shops and the, smaller time subs that don't like to, use it. But for the most part, our subs jumped right on board, and they had other GCs that were using it as well. So it was kind of something that they embraced and jumped into, and really helped us grow, what we were doing and getting it done quicker.
Yeah.
And I'll say for us, I'll also do somewhat of a shameless plug here, is we had a lot of struggles early on, right? A lot of challenges. And I just want to say that I appreciate that, Jones worked with us, and really what came out of that is we realized that, you guys really had a custom tailored platform and solution, right? And that was very critical to us, because it's not one size fits all. And I think every organization has different sensibilities, different priorities, different levels of risk tolerance, right? So, to have a product and a solution and a partner in all of this that is really willing to, fully customize the solution and tailor it to your needs, I think was, for us, it meant we stayed, and are hopefully a customer for life now, right? Whereas after the first 6 months or so, I thought we were going to be gone.
Right.
I think it was work.
Well,
So,
yeah, and just to tie into that, the collaboration, if you think anything big or small, I'm like, well, it'd be kind of nice if Jones did this. Next thing you know, they're asking more in-depth questions, and if it's possible, they're doing it. So they do tailor it to what you need out of it. So that's been wonderful.
That was going to be, rather than this cutesy sort of Q&A to kind of evoke the point, I think, the AI point I wanted to make, and shameless plug, we're you guys will see this. We are releasing our first AI first product. So right now our process is we use AI in various forms, but we have a team of reviewers that actually does the verification of what our AI does, right? We don't rely on AI to produce a result, right? It's a two-step process. But at the end of June, you will get, the moment an insurance document's updated, you'll get a compliance report that looks like this. That's the AI first generation. So it'll parse out all of the insurance documents so you can quickly get to the endorsements versus the certificates, and it will give you an AI sort of snapshot while we're fully reviewing things. So if you need to quickly jump on stuff and make snap decisions, some people have more urgency than others. But the point of it is that, I think people talk about AI all the time, but the reality is, like what you guys talk about, the benefits of Jones, it has much more to do with sort of the collaborative nature, the being able to separate what's it's not, is this $1 million of general liability each occurrence or not? It's the nuance, right? The esoteric things. And I imagine, Adam and Jessica, you would say that the human piece of it is just as important here as the technology.
It definitely is. I mean, everyone at first is like, oh, it's just AI. They don't know what they're doing. I'm like, it's not AI. You've gotten gaps. It's gotten through, AI, Jones, a person at Jones, and through me. So there, you always have your naysayers because some people are against AI, but I definitely think it's helpful. And this is going to be great for our sites and stuff, for the instant response, because you never know when someone goes, well, this happened. I need someone out on site in an hour. So.
Right.
Our industry has always kind of lagged behind in technology, right? Especially commercial real estate. And, one of the things that for us is okay, yeah, we were probably a little resistant to it at first, but, AI can help you in so many different forms and fashions, right? And it's not going to replace that human element, but it is certainly, it can improve, all your different processes, in terms of, automating different tasks and projects and improving functions and really the performance of your staff, your services and whatnot, right? So I think we've really embraced it over the last couple of years, but probably like most, we were a little resistant to it at first. Yeah, it's hugely helpful.
Yeah, I think the way I might translate that for folks on the call is if you're looking at AI platforms and stuff, you might see some really sexy stuff out there. But I think what Jessica and Adam have spoken to is it's nice as long as you have that connection to make sure it's tailored to confirm it and to smooth out the rough edges. And I think that's sort of been the Jones approach, is hey, use technology to augment outcomes that we're delivering with our support services and auditing services, and then increasingly invest in technology to drive those efficiencies as far as possible. But you know, we know there's sort of that human touch there. But well, thank you guys again. I just can't say enough how much I appreciate the time. For anyone who asks questions, I know they're kind of rolling in. We will try to summarize these and get out to you and share the materials. Adam, Jessica, appreciate your time. Thank you so much, and everyone have a really nice rest of your day.
You too. Thank you.
Take care.